Beneath the sidewalk of Pioneer Square in downtown Seattle, there is an entire neighborhood. Not a subway tunnel, not a utility corridor, a neighborhood, with storefronts and sidewalks and streets sitting 14 feet below the current ground level, sealed off from the daylight by the concrete and asphalt of the modern city above it. The storefronts still have their original plate glass windows, most of them cracked or clouded but intact. The sidewalks still have the purple glass prisms that were embedded in them to allow light to pass through to the basements below. The streets are narrow, dark, and smell of a century of damp. If you take the underground tour, a guided walk through 3 blocks of this subterranean district that has been operating as a tourist attraction since 1965, you will walk through ground-floor retail spaces that were last occupied in the 1900s. You will see display shelves, counter heights, door frames, and architectural details that belonged to a city that was simply built over and forgotten. Seattle did not tear down its old downtown. It buried it. And the buried district is still down there, structurally sound, architecturally readable, and almost completely ignored by the 750,000 people who walk above it every day. Seattle is not unique. Beneath the streets of at least a dozen major American cities, there are spaces, tunnels, chambers, corridors, entire districts that were built for purposes that no longer exist, sealed off from the surface by decades of construction and neglect, and largely unknown to the people who live above them. Some of these spaces are famous, some are classified, some are so thoroughly forgotten that their rediscovery comes as a genuine shock to the city officials who are theoretically responsible for maintaining them. This is the story of America's underground cities, what they were built for, why they were abandoned, and what it means that we built them at all. The Seattle Underground exists because of a combination of sewage, fire, and civic impatience. In the 1880s, Seattle was a boomtown of roughly 25,000 people, built on filled tide flats along Elliott Bay. The streets were at or near sea level, which created a sanitation problem that was both predictable and disgusting. The city's primitive sewer system relied on gravity to move waste toward the bay, but during high tides, the system reversed, pushing sewage back up through the pipes and into the streets. The toilets in Pioneer Square, according to contemporary accounts, would occasionally erupt like geysers during king tides, flooding businesses and residences with their own waste. The problem was well understood. The solution, raising the grade of the streets above the tidal level, was expensive and time-consuming. The city put it off. On June 6, 1889, a fire started in a cabinet shop on First Avenue when a pot of glue boiled over onto a pile of wood shavings. The fire spread rapidly through the wooden buildings of the commercial district and burned 25 blocks to the ground in approximately 12 hours. The entire central business district was destroyed, and the city, faced with the need to rebuild from scratch anyway, decided to solve the sewage problem at the same time. The new street grade would be 1 to 2 stories higher than the old one. The new buildings would be constructed at the new grade, with their entrances on the new higher street level. The old ground floors, the original storefronts that had faced the old streets, would become basements, buried beneath the raised roadway. The transition was messy and took years. During the construction period, roughly 1893 to 1907, the old street level and the new street level coexisted. Pedestrians walked on the original sidewalks, 14 feet below the new roadway, and climbed ladders to cross the street at the new grade. Merchants operated from both levels simultaneously, with entrances on the old ground floor and on the new street above. Gradually, the old sidewalks were covered with concrete vaults that supported the new sidewalks above. The old storefronts were sealed behind retaining walls. The underground district, cut off from light and air and customers, became a space used primarily for storage, for illicit gambling and drinking during Prohibition, and eventually for nothing at all. What survives today is a ghostly imprint of 1890s Seattle. Arched doorways, decorative cornices, tiled floors, and iron columns supporting the weight of a city that grew over them like a tree growing over a fence post. The underground spaces vary in condition from block to block. In some sections, the original plaster walls are still intact, with the ghosts of painted advertisements visible in the gloom. Prices for goods that have not been sold in over a century, in handwriting styles that nobody uses anymore. In other sections, the walls have been shored up with modern steel beams to prevent collapse, and the original architectural details have been obscured by decades of repair and patching. The floor is uneven because the original sidewalks were constructed on fill that has settled unevenly over time, and the air is thick with the smell of old brick and standing water. The purple glass prisms embedded in the sidewalks above are one of the most remarkable details of the Seattle Underground. These small, circular glass discs, typically 4 to 6 inches in diameter, were manufactured by the American Luxfer Prism Company and installed by the thousands in the concrete sidewalk vaults that covered the old street level. Their purpose was to transmit daylight from the surface sidewalk down to the underground spaces below, where the buried storefronts and basement businesses still needed light to operate. Each prism was designed to refract sunlight at an angle, directing it horizontally into the interior of the underground spaces, rather than simply allowing it to fall straight down. The prisms turned purple over time due to a reaction between the manganese dioxide in the glass and ultraviolet light, a process that takes decades and gives the surviving prisms a distinctive violet color that has become one of Seattle's more obscure historical markers. Most Seattle residents walk over these prisms daily without knowing what they are or what lies beneath them. The underground tour takes visitors through 3 connected blocks, but the actual underground extends much farther, beneath buildings that have never been opened to the public, in spaces that are considered structurally unsafe, in corridors that are flooded during heavy rains and infested with rats during dry spells. The full extent of Seattle's underground has never been completely mapped, because the property owners above ground have no particular interest in cataloging what lies beneath their foundations, and the city has no budget for the kind of comprehensive archaeological survey that the site deserves. 2,000 miles to the east, beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan, there is a different kind of underground city, one that was not buried by rising street grades, but was deliberately built underground and then deliberately abandoned. New York's subway system, which opened in 1904 and has expanded continuously since, contains approximately 20 abandoned stations, platforms, mezzanines, and connecting passages that were closed when the system was reconfigured and sealed off from public access. The most famous is City Hall Station, the original southern terminus of the first subway line, which opened on October 27, 1904, and closed on December 31, 1945. The abandoned stations of New York exist because the subway system has been in continuous operation and continuous modification for over 120 years. Unlike systems that were built to a fixed plan and then maintained as designed, the New York subway has been extended, rerouted, merged, and reconfigured so many times that entire stations have become redundant, too close to neighboring stations that were expanded, or too sharply curved to accommodate modern train lengths, or simply unnecessary after service changes eliminated the lines they served. When a station is decommissioned, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority does not demolish it. Demolition underground is expensive, dangerous, and pointless. The space cannot be used for anything else, and the structural elements of the station often support the street above. So the stations are simply closed, their entrances sealed with concrete or steel plates, and the trains that still pass through them do so without stopping, their passengers briefly illuminated by the emergency lights that still burn in the empty platforms. City Hall Station was designed to be the crown jewel of the New York subway system. The architects, Hines and Lafarge, who also designed the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, created a vaulted ceiling of Guastavino tile in a pattern of interlocking arches that is widely regarded as the most beautiful interior space in any subway system in the world. The platform curves gracefully to follow the turning radius of the City Hall loop, lit by skylights set into the vault of the street above. Brass chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Leaded glass windows admitted filtered daylight. The tile work, cream and green and terracotta, laid in geometric patterns, was executed with a craftsmanship that would be prohibitively expensive today and was, even in 1904, a deliberate statement of civic ambition. The subway was new. It was supposed to represent progress, modernity, and the future of urban transportation. City Hall Station was its showpiece. The station was closed in 1945 because the curve of the platform was too tight to accommodate the longer trains that the system had adopted. Extending the platform was impractical because of the curve. So the station was simply closed. The entrances were sealed. The tilework, the chandeliers, the skylights, the Guastavino arches, all of it was left in place, untouched, in a sealed chamber beneath City Hall Park. The station is still there. Trains pass through it on the number 6 line loop without stopping. If you stay on the 6 train past its last stop at Brooklyn Bridge and ride the loop, you can catch a brief glimpse of City Hall Station through the train windows, the Guastavino tiles glowing in the emergency lighting, the empty platform curving away into the darkness, the chandeliers still hanging from their chains. It is one of the most haunting sights in New York, visible for approximately 30 seconds and then gone. City Hall Station is the most famous of New York's abandoned subway stations, but it is not alone. Worth Street Station closed in 1962. 18th Street Station on the Lexington Avenue line closed in 1948. 91st Street Station on the Broadway line closed in 1959. Myrtle Avenue Station closed in 1956. Each closure followed the same pattern. The station became redundant due to system changes, it was closed, and it was sealed. The platforms are still there. The tilework, with its station-specific color schemes and mosaic name tablets, is still legible. The turnstiles, in some cases, are still in position. These are not ruins. They are intact public spaces that were simply locked and left. Beneath the loop in downtown Chicago, there is a tunnel system that most Chicagoans have never heard of, despite the fact that it extends for approximately 60 miles beneath the streets of the Central Business District. The Chicago freight tunnels were built between 1899 and 1906 by the Illinois Telephone and Telegraph Company, ostensibly for telephone cable installation. In practice, the tunnels were used for a far more ambitious purpose, an underground, narrow-gauge railroad that transported coal, merchandise, construction debris, and mail between the basements of loop buildings, without the street-level congestion that made surface delivery slow and expensive. The tunnels were dug 40 feet below street level, lined with concrete, and equipped with electric locomotives that pulled small freight cars on 2-foot gauge track. At their peak, the tunnels served over 60 office buildings and department stores, connected to the Illinois Central Railroad's freight terminal, and handled thousands of tons of material daily. At their peak in the 1920s and 1930s, the tunnels employed over 300 workers, locomotive operators, track maintenance crews, loading dock workers, and dispatchers who coordinated the movement of freight cars through the network from a central control room. The system operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Department stores like Marshall Field's received their merchandise through basement loading docks connected to the tunnel system, which meant that delivery trucks did not need to navigate the congested loop streets at all. The U.S. Post Office used the tunnels to move mail between the main post office and substations throughout downtown. Coal was delivered to building furnaces through the tunnels in winter, and ash was removed the same way. The system was, in effect, an underground circulatory system that kept the loop functioning without the surface congestion that would have brought the commercial district to a standstill. The tunnel system was profitable until the 1950s, when truck delivery became cheaper and more flexible than maintaining a dedicated underground railroad. The railroad company went bankrupt in 1959, and the tunnels were abandoned. The tracks were pulled up, the electric infrastructure was removed. The tunnels were sealed at their basement-level connections to loop buildings and, for the most part, forgotten. They were remembered abruptly on April 13, 1992, when a construction crew driving pilings for a new bridge over the Chicago River accidentally punctured the tunnel wall. The river poured into the tunnel system, which, being interconnected, flooded the basements of buildings throughout the loop. Over 250 million gallons of water entered the tunnels, causing an estimated $1.95 billion in damage, shutting down the loop for weeks and revealing to most Chicagoans, for the first time, that an entire underground railroad existed beneath their feet. The tunnels were pumped out, patched, and sealed again. They are still down there, flooded in places, dry in others. 60 miles of underground infrastructure that was built, used, abandoned, flooded, and forgotten within a single century. The story repeats in city after city with local variations but a consistent pattern. In Boston, there are sections of the original Tremont Street subway, the first subway in North America, which opened on September 1, 1897, that have been sealed off and bypassed as the system was expanded and modernized. The original Tremont Street tunnel was built using the cut and cover method. Dig a trench in the street, build the tunnel structure, and cover it back up. The tunnel ran beneath Tremont Street from the Park Street station to the Boylston station, a distance of less than a mile, and was designed for streetcars rather than the heavy rail trains that replaced them. When the system was converted to rapid transit in the 20th century, some sections of the original 1897 tunnel were abandoned in place, their brick-lined walls and arched ceilings still intact beneath the newer infrastructure that was built around and above them. Workers who maintain the Green Line occasionally encounter sections of the original tunnel, older, narrower, built with different materials and different engineering standards, embedded in the walls of the modern system like fossils in sedimentary rock. In Portland, Oregon, the Shanghai Tunnels, a network of basement-level passages connecting the waterfront bars and hotels of Old Town to the docks on the Willamette River, were allegedly used in the 19th century to kidnap men for forced labor on merchant ships, a practice known as Shanghaiing. The historical evidence for this specific use is debated by historians, but the tunnels themselves are real. A labyrinth of brick-lined corridors, holding cells, and connecting passages that extend beneath several blocks of Old Town. Some have been incorporated into bar basements, others are sealed and inaccessible. The tunnels exist in a strange historical limbo, too well documented to be dismissed as legend, too poorly studied to be fully understood. In Houston, a different kind of underground city exists. One that is neither abandoned nor forgotten, but that operates in plain sight while remaining invisible to most visitors. The Houston Tunnel System is a network of climate-controlled pedestrian tunnels connecting the major office buildings, hotels, and shopping centers of downtown Houston. The tunnels extend for approximately 7 miles and are used daily by thousands of office workers who walk between buildings, eat lunch in underground food courts, and buy their coffee and dry cleaning without ever setting foot on the surface. The tunnels were built beginning in the 1930s by individual building owners who wanted to provide their tenants with a way to move between buildings without enduring Houston's brutal summer heat. Over the decades, the individual tunnels were connected into a continuous network maintained by the Downtown Houston Management District. The Houston tunnels are not underground ruins. They are a functioning parallel city, a second downtown that operates beneath the first, with its own restaurants, shops, banks, and barbershops, open during business hours and locked at night. The tunnels represent the opposite end of the underground spectrum from Seattle's buried storefronts. Not a forgotten city, but a deliberately hidden one, built not because the surface was destroyed, but because the surface was simply too hot to walk on for 5 months of the year. Houston built its underground city not out of necessity or negligence, but out of air conditioning. In Cincinnati, the city began building a subway system in 1920 and never finished it. The tunnels, approximately 2 miles of completed bore, including stations with finished platforms and tile work, sit empty beneath Central Parkway, a surface boulevard that was built over the former Miami and Erie Canal. The Cincinnati subway is sometimes called the largest abandoned subway in America, and the title is probably accurate. The system was conceived as a response to the same congestion problems that motivated subway construction in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Cincinnati in the 1910s was a booming industrial city of over 400,000 people, and its surface streets were choked with streetcars, automobiles, horse-drawn wagons, and pedestrians. The original plan called for a 16-mile loop that would connect the major residential neighborhoods to downtown, running partly through the abandoned canal bed that had been drained decades earlier. Voters approved a $6 million bond issue in 1916, and construction began in 1920 on the 2-mile section beneath Central Parkway. The workers dug through clay and limestone, lined the tunnel with reinforced concrete, and built stations with the same attention to finish work that characterized subway construction in other cities: tiled walls, terrazzo floors, iron railings. Then the costs overran the budget. the post-war inflation of the early 1920s drove construction expenses far above the original estimates. The $6 million bond issue covered only the first 2 miles. Additional funding would require another bond vote, and the political appetite for subway spending had evaporated. The project was suspended in 1927 and has never been resumed. Construction was halted in 1927 when the bond funding ran out, and despite periodic proposals to complete or repurpose the system, including a 1980s plan to turn the tunnels into a water main and a 2000s proposal for a bus rapid transit route, the tunnels have remained empty for nearly a century. The stations are remarkably intact. Poured concrete platforms, steel columns, tile walls, and lighting fixtures that were installed but never connected to power. The Cincinnati subway is a monument to a city that tried to build the infrastructure of a major metropolis and then lacked the political will or the financial capacity to complete the project. The tunnels are occasionally opened for guided tours, and the visitors who walk through them report an unsettling sense of displacement, the physical sensation of standing in a space that was designed for thousands of daily commuters and has never seen a single one. In San Francisco, the ruins of the ships that were abandoned during the gold rush of 1849 lie buried beneath the streets of the financial district. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in January 1848, ships from around the world sailed into San Francisco Bay carrying prospectors, merchants, and adventurers. When they arrived, the crews abandoned the ships to join the gold rush, and the empty vessels were left at anchor in the harbor. Hundreds of ships accumulated in Yerba Buena Cove, so many that the city simply filled in the cove around them, using the ships as foundations for buildings, wharves, and streets. The ships were buried in sand and rubble, their masts cut off, their hulls filled with earth. Today, the financial district, the neighborhood bounded roughly by Market Street, the Embarcadero, Broadway, and Sansom Street, sits on top of these buried vessels. Construction projects in the area regularly encounter ship timbers, rigging hardware, and hull planking at depths of 10 to 30 feet below the modern street level. A ship called the General Harrison, an 1840s merchant vessel, was discovered during construction of the Transamerica Pyramid in the 1960s. The Niantic, a whaling ship that was converted into a warehouse and hotel before being buried in landfill, was excavated in 1978. An estimated 70 to 80 ships remain buried beneath the streets, their locations mapped by the San Francisco Maritime National Historical Park using historical records and ground-penetrating radar. Every person walking down Montgomery Street or Battery Street is walking on top of a fleet. In Los Angeles, a different kind of underground space exists beneath the streets of downtown. During Prohibition, a network of tunnels connected the basements of speakeasies, hotels, and municipal buildings in the area around Main Street and Spring Street. The tunnels allowed patrons to move between drinking establishments without being seen on the surface, and they allegedly allowed bootleggers to transport liquor from delivery trucks to bar basements without exposure to police patrols. After Prohibition ended in 1933, the tunnels lost their primary function but were not sealed. They continued to be used informally for decades, for storage, for pedestrian shortcuts between buildings, and, during the Cold War, as designated fallout shelters stocked with water, crackers, and medical supplies by the Federal Civil Defense Administration. Some of the tunnels have been incorporated into the basements of buildings that were renovated in the 2000s and 2010s as part of downtown LA's revitalization. Others remain sealed, their entrances bricked over or hidden behind drywall in sub-basement corridors that building maintenance staff avoid because they are dark, damp, and poorly ventilated. In Washington, D.C., a network of steam tunnels connects the major federal buildings on the National Mall and along Pennsylvania Avenue. The tunnels, built beginning in the late 19th century and expanded through the 20th, carry steam pipes from a central heating plant to the Capitol, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian Museums, and various executive branch buildings. They also carry, in some sections, communication cables, water mains, and electrical conduits. The tunnels are maintained by the architect of the Capitol and are not accessible to the public, but they form a parallel infrastructure beneath the most photographed streetscape in America. a hidden mechanical system that keeps the visible buildings heated, cooled, and connected, without the unsightly tangle of surface utilities that would compromise the mall's carefully curated appearance of neoclassical permanence. Workers who maintain the steam tunnels describe a subterranean world of extreme temperatures. The pipes carry steam at over 300 degrees Fahrenheit, poor air quality, and a warren of passages that is so complex that new workers sometimes get lost. The tunnels are not secret exactly, but they are invisible to the millions of tourists who walk the mall every year without any awareness that a functioning industrial infrastructure is operating directly beneath their feet. There is one more underground space that deserves mention, and it is unlike any of the others on this list because it was built not for commerce or transportation or utilities, but for survival. In the small town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, a coal mining community of roughly 1,000 people about 80 miles northeast of Harrisburg, a coal seam fire has been burning underground since 1962. The fire started in a trash dump that was located in an abandoned strip mine pit, and the flames ignited an exposed coal seam that connected to the vast network of coal mines that honeycomb the earth beneath the town. The fire spread through the mines, following the coal seams in every direction, and it has been burning continuously for over 60 years. It is expected to continue burning for another 250 years because the coal deposit is extensive and there is no practical way to extinguish a fire that is burning 40 to 300 feet underground across an area of several square miles. The underground fire in Centralia is not a tunnel or a buried district or an abandoned subway station. It is, in a sense, the inverse of all those things. Where Seattle buried a city and forgot it, Centralia's underground actively invaded the surface, cracking roads, venting toxic gases, opening sinkholes that could swallow a person without warning. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was walking in his grandmother's backyard when the ground opened beneath his feet and he fell into a sinkhole that dropped him into a mine void filled with carbon monoxide and steam. His cousin pulled him out by his arms. He survived, but the incident made national news and accelerated the federal government's decision to relocate the town's residents. Over the next 2 decades, the government purchased most of the homes in Centralia through eminent domain and relocated their occupants. The town's zip code was revoked in 2002. As of the last count, fewer than 10 residents remain, living in houses surrounded by empty lots and cracked pavement from which wisps of steam rise on cold mornings. Centralia's underground is not a space you can visit or tour or photograph. It is a space that is actively hostile to human presence, hot, toxic, structurally unstable, and expanding. But it belongs in this story because it represents the most extreme version of the relationship between the surface city and the underground. A case where the underground did not merely support or supply or inconvenience the city above it, but actively destroyed it. The underground won, the surface lost. And the lesson? That we build on top of things we do not fully understand, and that those things can eventually demand a reckoning, applies to every underground space on this list, even the benign ones. The question that connects all of these underground spaces, from Seattle's buried downtown to New York's abandoned subway stations, to Chicago's freight tunnels, to Cincinnati's unfinished transit system, to the burning mines of Centralia, is not engineering or architecture. It is memory. Why do we build these things and then forget them? The answer is partly economic. Underground infrastructure becomes invisible when it becomes unprofitable, and unprofitable things in American cities tend to disappear from public awareness with remarkable speed. A freight tunnel that generates revenue is maintained, documented, and managed. A freight tunnel that stops generating revenue is sealed, abandoned, and forgotten within a generation. The same economic logic that built it erases it. The physical structure remains, but the institutional knowledge of its existence fades. But there is another answer, one that is harder to articulate and more unsettling to consider. We forget these spaces because their existence complicates the story we tell about our cities. A city's self-image is built on its visible surface, its skyline, its streets, its landmarks, its public spaces. The underground contradicts that image. It reveals that the surface city is built on top of something else, something older, something that was discarded or outgrown or abandoned when it stopped serving the needs of the moment. The underground is evidence of discontinuity in a culture that prefers to narrate its history as progress. If you acknowledge that an entire district of your city was simply built over and sealed, as in Seattle, you are acknowledging that the city you live in is not the first version of itself, and that the current version may not be the last. That is an uncomfortable thought in a culture that equates newness with improvement and treats the past as something to be transcended rather than understood. Consider what it means that beneath the streets of a single American city, Chicago for example, there are simultaneously 60 miles of abandoned freight tunnels, sealed subway stations from the original transit system, steam pipe corridors carrying heat to downtown buildings, cable vaults containing the communication infrastructure of the modern internet, water mains dating back to the 1860s, sewer lines that predate the reversal of the Chicago River, and the foundations of buildings that were demolished on the surface, but whose subbasements were simply filled with rubble and built over. Layer upon layer upon layer, each one representing a different era's technological ambitions and a different era's definition of what was worth maintaining and what was worth abandoning. The underground of any major American city is not a single space, but a geological stratigraphy of human infrastructure, a record of every decision the city ever made about what to build, what to abandon, and what to bury. And beneath all of that, in many American cities, are the traces of a still older occupation. In New York, construction workers building the foundations of the World Trade Center in the 1960s discovered the hull of a ship from the early 18th century, buried in landfill that had extended the shoreline of Manhattan. In Philadelphia, excavations for an underground parking garage uncovered a colonial-era privy that contained artifacts dating to the 1740s, bottles, dishes, coins, and animal bones that had been discarded 2.5 centuries earlier and preserved by the anaerobic conditions underground. In every American city old enough to have a pre-industrial history, the underground contains not just the infrastructure of the modern era, but the refuse, the foundations, and the forgotten structures of every era before it. The underground is an archive. It preserves what the surface discards. The spaces are still there. The Guastavino tiles in City Hall Station have not faded. The freight tunnels beneath the loop have not collapsed. The storefronts of 1890s Seattle have not rotted. The Cincinnati subway platforms are still level and clean and waiting for trains that will never come. The infrastructure endures because it was built to endure, with brick, stone, tile, concrete, and steel, by workers who took their craft seriously and whose names are, in almost every case, lost to history. The Italian tile setters who laid the Guastavino arches in City Hall Station, the Irish tunnel workers who dug Chicago's freight system 40 feet below the loop, the laborers who raised Seattle's street grade one retaining wall at a time, shoveling fill into the gaps between old ground floors and new sidewalks, the miners who bore through Cincinnati's limestone for a subway that nobody would ever ride. These workers built with the assumption that their work would be used. They did not expect it to be abandoned. They did not expect to be forgotten. But they built well enough that their work survived the forgetting, which is perhaps the only kind of immortality that manual labor can achieve. What did not endure is the memory of why it was built, who built it, and what it meant to the city that produced it. If you have been to Seattle's Underground tour, or if you have ridden the 6-train loop past City Hall Station in New York, or if you have heard the story of the Chicago freight tunnel flood, or if you live in a city and have ever wondered what is beneath the street you walk on every day, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me what you know about the underground spaces in your city. Because every city in America is built on top of something, and the something is almost always more interesting than the surface we settled for. And if this story made you think about what we bury, not just physically beneath concrete and asphalt, but historically beneath the narrative of progress and modernization that every American city uses to explain itself, subscribe to The Buried Record. Because the record is not always on the surface. Sometimes it is 14 feet below the sidewalk, behind a sealed door, in a room that nobody has entered in 100 years. and it is still there.